Try to keep it moving. We'll talk a little bit about like Tamerlane and some other Mongols and stuff like that. So when I want to move here, I just want to move a little east. We're going to go to Japan and Korea. All right. It's the first time we've been here, educationally speaking. All right, chapter 3 didn't cover that. And a lot of times these textbooks will kind of group these two countries and cultures, kind of early histories together, mainly because geographically they're pretty close to one another. There's some similarities in the sense that they tend to be kind of early on kind of overshadowed by China, and there's some influences on China, like their early written languages were using Chinese characters and stuff. So they kind of put them kind of together in that sense. Now, like I was telling some other classes, there's a couple things as Americans we're not that great at. One is understanding the metric system. It's all based on tens. It's a little complicated. And the other is geography. We're not a country that really is we're America, right? We don't really concern ourselves with a lot of other places. Geographically speaking, if let's say, and this is my kendo stick, all right, which is kind of associated with Japanese culture here. I have a name on it, like when I would do like the fire drills, so people could see it. But I used to take this out. My brother-in-law, I had a brother-in-law that was a foreign exchange student in Japan, and so he brought this back. So this is what they would use in PE, which seems kind of fun. And so I would normally kind of like when people would go to the mall, I tend to go to the mall a lot, and I would like take my kendo stick with me, and I'd ask like various questions to people, and if they didn't get the answer right, I'd crack them in the head. It took me about 3 or 4 times, like before the mall cops like were kind of looking out for me in the food court. So let's say, like hypothetically, let's say I was just like, can you point out Japan on the map? And I'd just go where? Oh, right here. Good. Now, if you would have said here, then I would have cracked like that, and then I ran off, and then the mall cops would have to chase after me. So Japan, right here, is what we call an archipelago. Anybody have geography with Miss Lindauer or Miss Flowers? You guys know what an archipelago is?
Isn't it like a group of islands?
Yeah, group of islands. Like Hawaii is like an archipelago. All right. Korea is right over here. All right. Which Korea today, the modern day country, is split into north and south. Right. It's a peninsula, which is like kind of a piece of land that kind of extends out from a larger landmass there. So you see geographically they're kind of close to one another. All right. Both are pretty homogenous countries to a certain extent. So the early histories of them, we'll start with Japan and then kind of work my way into Korea here. The early history of Japan, like what we kind of really like prehistory here, we see the first settlements around the kind of Neolithic period into the Bronze Age. There's 2 cultures that like through DNA evidence, and like I said, Japan is particularly homogenous. About 98% of those who live in Japan are ethnically Japanese. I have a nephew that is currently teaching in English at the university in Tokyo there. And there's a lot of guest workers in that. But immigration is for Japan has been traditionally kind of closed off in a lot of periods of their history. But ethnically speaking, they're a mix of one is Jomon, which is the first civilization I believe that developed. It's kind of the indigenous population, mainly in the northern islands there. And the Yoi, which are significant because the Yoi introduced systematic agriculture to Japan, in particular what crop, which is a staple crop in East Asia? Rice, boom, rice, yeah, all right. So with the introduction of wet kind of rice agriculture, where you have like rice paddies and stuff like that. Now, both of these civilizations leave behind pottery and tools and stuff like that, but they don't leave behind written records. Right? And so they're classified still as kind of prehistory, if you will. All right. So generally, those who would classify themselves ethnically Japanese are probably closer, kind of DNA-wise, to the Yoi. There is one example of a culture in the very northern part of Japan called the Ainu, which make up not quite 1% of the population. They're what we classify as the indigenous population there. The Ainu are particularly are kind of distinct, particularly those of the older generation, where women kind of tattoo their lips. I don't know if you can kind of see that kind of around their lips there. Now, the younger generations tend to kind of integrate more into kind of Japanese culture, if you will. So this kind of they had, and the Ainu had their own distinct language. As one of those languages is kind of dying out, if you will. But the earliest history, when we talk about history, like written evidence, a lot of it comes from their connection to China. All right, and so usually around 300 is when kind of Japanese history people start to kind of delve into it. Japan was made up according to kind of Chinese chroniclers, and the first mention of Japan amongst the kind of Chinese chroniclers, what they were referred to as the state of Wa, W-A. Another term was Nippon as well. But at one point, there's one of these clans, which is basically kind of like, according to Chinese chroniclers, that comes to dominate the rest of the archipelago, and that's the Yamato clan. So around the early part of the 300s. They're the first ones to call their chief something higher than the chieftain, if you will, what we would classify as emperor. Today, Japan is a constitutional monarchy, much like how Great Britain is, right? They have a queen, there's an emperor in Japan. However, the current emperor of Japan is of the same kind of clan, the same family as the Yamato clan. Right? This is considered the oldest continuous line of any royal family. They're referred to as the chrysanthemum throne. Right? So, like for example, in England, the Windsors today, the Windsors have their origins in Germany. There's been multiple dynasties, multiple families that were basically on the throne there. In Japan, it's been one continuous family up to this point. Right? And so the Yamato are going to basically kind of influence the rest of Japan, particularly when it comes to like things like religion. All right. Their religion is a kind of form of animism that is traditionally referred to as Shinto. Now, the name Shinto actually comes from the Chinese for the term meaning way of the gods. And so Shinto, like I said, is kind of it has a mythology. There's a kind of a sun deity, goddess, if you will. There's an emphasis on venerating the ancestors and that, but there's a big emphasis on spirits that represent natural elements called kami. All right, and so things like mountains and rivers and trees and stuff like that all play an important spiritual connection here in Shinto. Shinto is inherently Japanese. It's one of these, like we talk about like Islam and Buddhism and Christianity, which are religions that tend to transcend the kind of borders. Shinto is just kind of inherently Japanese. Right? You don't find it any place outside of either Japan or kind of Japanese communities, if you will. A lot of Shinto shrines are kind of reflect this kind of like natural elements, are kind of built in kind of wooded areas and such. All right, like this Shinto shrine outside of Tokyo. You see right in the foreground there is the bonsai tree. I don't know if you guys have ever seen those bonsai trees before. That's that comes out of Shinto. Usually in front of every Shinto kind of temple is what they call the Torii Gate, which is kind of the entrance into kind of a spiritual realm, if you will. This is an interesting Torii. This is in a Shinto shrine that's on a lake in Hiroshima, and you see the mountains kind of in the background there. Also, you'll find these little kind of like they're like these tree trunks that they'll kind of put these little prayer ties around to kind of venerate your ancestors. And this is kind of similar to like I was raised Catholic, and after Mass, my mom would always go and light a candle to a certain extent here. All right, so Shinto, like I said, is the kind of inherently kind of Japanese religion, although the name comes from Chinese. However, around 500, we start to see the Japanese having more and more contact with mainland China. Matter of fact, the name Japan comes from the Chinese term Japan, which means origin of the sun. So to the Chinese, when you look east, that's where the sun would rise. All right, so that's why we basically on the flag of Japan, you see the sun disk there. Japanese, like I said, adopted Chinese system of writing, other cultural customs, like particularly during the Tang Dynasty, like the tea ceremony and such. And then we see through their connection to China, the introduction of Buddhism. All right, this is usually credited to a 6th century prince by the name of Prince Shotoku. Shotoku was the son of the emperor at the time, but he wasn't destined to become emperor. His mother was a minor wife. Right? But what he does is he inserts himself into kind of like the kind of court government and that, and he hears about Buddhism and sends essentially ambassadors to China. And this is during the time of the Sui dynasty to bring back texts. All right. There's evidence that Shotoku actually basically corresponded with the first emperor of the Sui dynasty, Emperor Wen. And we see this mixing of kind of various kind of cultures like Buddhism and Shinto and even like Confucianism start to emerge. Shotoku is also credited with establishing what is considered the first constitution in Japan, called the 17-article constitution. However, it's not really like a true constitution like in the form of like plan of governing. It's more of kind of these ethical standards and stuff which show the influence of Buddhism and Shinto and Confucianism and that. There's my man Prince Shotoku in the middle. Now flanking him to the right is his son, and to the left is his brother, his youngest brother. So basically his oldest son, and his youngest brother are basically the same age. I have a similar situation where I have a brother that was 27 years old when I was born. So he had 2 kids before I was born. So I have a nephew that's a couple years older than me and a niece that's like a year older than me. So I can kind of relate there. Matter of fact, when I go visit my nephew, we were cousins because it was too complicated to explain to his friends that his uncle was younger than him. So, but I digress. All right. And so the kind of eventually the form of Buddhism that becomes popular in Japan, and we'll talk about the emerging Buddhist kind of sects and schools, like Mahayana Buddhism, which Zen Buddhism is part of, next week. But Zen Buddhism is this kind of form of Buddhism where it's not just like enlightenment obtained through kind of like meditation, but enlightenment obtained through kind of the task at hand. So perfection at the task at hand could create enlightenment. So in the 1970s, there was a lot of hippies that started to kind of gravitate towards Eastern philosophies. There was a series of books that were printed in the 1970s. The first one was called Zen and the Art of Archery. And there was another one called Zen and the Art of Tennis, which archery and tennis were almost kind of like metaphors, but the idea is that you perfect the skill at hand. And by delving into this and basically really taking this seriously, you'll obtain kind of a level of consciousness and kind of spirituality. All right. And so when they say reach Zen, you're basically kind of reach this kind of higher plateau that's kind of created through your basically kind of strict adherence or basically kind of discipline to a task. This is the kind of the popular form of Buddhism. It mixes Shinto, it mixes Confucianism in there. And like I said, it's part of what we call Mahayana Buddhism. All right. Now, around the kind of the basically the 8th century or so, we start to see a emergence of a kind of where Japan starts to assert a little bit more of its kind of identity rather than just being kind of replicating kind of Chinese culture. And this is called the Heian Age. The Heian Age in particular was one of the golden ages when it comes to kind of Japanese literature. We start to see things that are inherently Japanese, like the haiku style of poetry. You guys heard of haiku, right? Like haikus are essentially basically kind of 3-line poems based on syllable structure. First line's 5 syllables, second line 7 syllables, third line's 5 syllables. All right. And so there's another form of poetry called waka, which is basically 5-7-5-7-5. And there's a lot of emphasis on haikus on nature. That's its kind of reflection on Shinto. So in the past, they used to have like people like write out haikus for like extra credit. I'm not gonna make you guys do that because I used to have it right on the back of the Scantron, if you will. Have you ever had English teachers that did that? I know there was like one English teacher was having people write haikus. I have a kind of a book here on Japanese literature that I used to read haikus out of and such. Do you guys want me to read you one?
Yeah.
Okay. I'll read a couple. Now this is from the Tokugawa era, which is a little bit later. It's like 1600s, but same idea. Nashi no hana, Sasuke ni fumiyomo, anaurari. And that, of course, means blossoms on the pear, and a woman in the moonlight reads a letter there.
No.
Can I read another one?
Yeah.
Can you read a lot more?
Sakura Chanya! Nawashiro Mizuya! And that's, of course, scattered petals lie on the rice-seething waters, stars in the moonlit sky.
That's beautiful.
Yeah, this one here is my favorite one. Harusamuya! Kawazumi no Harino! Spring rain, and as yet, the little frontlets' bellies haven't gotten wet. So that's an example of kind of haikus. All right.
Those are great.
Thank you. Hopefully, anybody out there, I have this recorded, doesn't send this, and I'm insulting Japanese culture, and that's not my intention. I was just reading how my son would watch the Dragon Ball Z. Now, also what we see here is like the evidence of kind of like a literary movement that is sparked by women in the kind of courtly life in Japan, in the capital of Heian-kyo. The emergence of what they consider the first real novel, true novel, called The Tale of Genji. Again, this is somewhat debatable. This is around 1000. This is written by a woman of the kind of the court named Murashaki Shikubu. Genji, and when I talk about novel, like we talked about like the Iliad and the Odyssey and the Aeneid and the Epic of Gilgamesh, all those are like kind of stories that are kind of based in mythology. They're kind of hero stories and journeys, if you will. The Tale of Genji is a novel. It takes a kind of a fictional character that could be based on a real person, all right? And it's a soap opera. Genji, the main character here, is the son of the emperor, but he is not destined to inherit. And he ends up falling in love with his stepmother, all right, who are they're basically roughly the same age. They feel the same about each other, but they can never kind of like carry this kind of like emotion out. So this kind of basically permeates Genji's personal relationships around. It's basically a story of his life. It gives people an insight into the courtly life in Japan, and so this is kind of like it's like a soap opera, and so to a certain extent, this is like kind of like a more kind of like high class literary version of, let's say, TMZ or People Magazine to a certain extent. And there's certain connections here. This is something that kind of runs throughout kind of history, is that there are people that kind of enjoy watching the rich and powerful sometimes go through trials and tribulations. In German, they refer to it as Schadenfreude, the idea of finding joy in people's misfortunes, particularly those that are kind of like higher class than that. That's why people read tabloids and kind of like, and all that stuff. Tale of Genji is kind of like that to a certain extent. But more importantly, it gives people an insight into kind of Japanese courtly life that they wouldn't have access to, so to speak. There's Murasaki Shikubu. And then another kind of literary figure that was a contemporary of Murasaki Shikubu is Shei Shonagon. She writes what they consider the second novel, but it's really kind of a collection of short stories called The Pillow Book. There is evidence, though, they found Murasaki Shikubu's, or what they claim to be Murasaki Shikubu's diary, which states that her and Shei were not necessarily friends. Matter of fact, Murasaki Shikubu talks about how Shei and other women within the court are jealous of her intellect and such. And there's one historian, literary historian, who claims that Shei might have been a writer on the Tale of Genji, that might have not just been one person. Because it's weird, in the story, it kind of stops abruptly, and then it picks back up. It's like it's lost. It picks back up talking about Genji's son and daughter. So it's kind of as they're adults. It's kind of a weird transition, if you will. So some people believe that it may have been a compiling or kind of a group of writers that wrote this. But the literary kind of like movement within this era is sparked by females. It's sparked by women within the court system. Now they refer to this as the Heian Age because it's named after the capital Heian-Kyo, which we know today as Kyoto. So that was moved in 794 as the capital from the city of Nara by the Emperor Kanmu, who, from some historical accounts, moved the capital away from Nara to diminish the influence of a kind of Buddhist monk political class that started to emerge there in the 8th century. So this is the era of kind of the beginning of kind of Japanese feudalism, as we kind of know it. And so Kyoto remained the capital of Japan, and for the most part, up until the Meiji Restoration in the 1800s, when it was moved to the city of Edo, which we know today as Tokyo. All right. So that's why they refer to it as the Heian Age, because the actual name of Kyoto is Heian-Kyo. There's my man Kanmu. Now he planned the city was built using Chang'an, the capital of the Tang Dynasty, as the kind of replica of the city. They're basically both built on a grid system. The Emperor's Palace is supposed to represent the North Star. But this is we start to see the beginning of kind of Japanese feudal culture and the emergence of certain classes based on the ownership of land and military service. Probably the most famous group that comes out of that are the samurai. I'm going to play this little video that I'm going to have to cut out later when I post this because
Japan, from around the 1200s to the 1600s, was a feudal society. The emperor presided over a splendid court at Heian, but the real power lay in the hands of a supreme military commander called a shogun. To expand his control, the shogun gave large parcels of land to lesser warlords called daimyo, in return for their agreement to support the shogun with their armies in times of need. The armies were composed of great warriors called samurai. In return for their unswerving loyalty, the daimyo rewarded the samurai with gifts of land. With the aid of the samurai, the daimyo were able to control Japan for more than 400 years. Samurai were known for their great skill with the sword. Their swords sliced swiftly and precisely, making the samurai a deadly opponent. Their extraordinary military prowess was based on extraordinary achievements in technology. The samurai sword had to be hard enough to hold a sharp edge and flexible enough to absorb blows without breaking. Japanese sword makers were among the first to solve this problem, creating a blade that was both sharp and resilient, and they did it more than 800 years ago. The samurai were known not only for the advanced technology of their swords, but also for their ability to use them. Samurai studied martial arts here at the Karshma Grand Shrine. Like a chess player, a samurai always thought several moves ahead. A samurai learned hundreds of combinations of moves and trained relentlessly until his strokes became second nature, and his mind, body, and sword moved as one. Hard, flexible swords weren't the samurai's only technological innovation. While Europeans made armor from metal, samurai used a flexible material woven from leather, iron, bamboo, and silk.
この鎧は非常に豪華にできてまして、戦いで用いるというよりも、何か合戦場における装束というような趣があるものが日本の甲冑だと思います。
These small plates made of tough rawhide were the building blocks of the armor. The armor maker cut holes for stitching and smoothed each plate before joining them together in a flexible panel. These overlapping panels helped cushion a sword's blow, and because they were flexible, they bent with the blade's impact, which made it difficult for the opponent to do any damage. But 300 years after the samurai rose to power, a new invention changed their way of life forever. In the mid-1500s, a samurai warlord bought a new weapon from Portuguese traders. He turned it over to his master swordsmiths. Within 50 years, the Japanese were making more guns than any country in Europe. Soon warlords were fighting each other with armies of up to 60,000 warriors, including thousands of gunners. To protect their masters against these new weapons, the samurai built large, strong castles throughout Japan. And none shows the brilliance of the samurai's master builders as clearly as Himeji Castle. Its complex system of multiple towers, moats, and walls was designed to confuse and trap invaders. Although many Japanese castles were destroyed in battle, the formidable Himeji was never once attacked, perhaps because no one who saw it could imagine it was possible to take. With the help of the gun, one warlord, Tokugawa Ieyasu, defeated all his rivals in the early 1600s. The Tokugawa shoguns brought an era of peace and stability to Japan. The age of samurai warfare was coming to an end.
Right, so like I said, we start to see the emergence of kind of feudal classes that there's a little bit of comparison with European feudalism to a certain extent. So we have obviously at the top of the kind of social stratus of the pyramid there, you have the emperor. But then we have like the kind of the warlords, daimyo, right? That would basically govern areas that later Japanese refer to as prefectures, right? And then the daimyo was supposed to kind of generate a military and army for the emperor when needed, when called upon. So they would generate like infantry, foot soldiers, but what you wanted to get was as many kind of like soldiers on horseback, samurai. These are the ones who kind of the warriors who fought for lords, for the daimyo. They are the knights, if you will, of kind of European, like compared to kind of European feudalism. Like in like they had a code of honor, like the European knights had chivalry. The samurai had bushido, named after Bushi, which was another word kind of from samurai there. however, the difference is that Japanese samurai took Bushido much more seriously than European knights took chivalry. Chivalry is really, rarely did European knights obtain that. Right? In many cases, European knights kind of were almost served as kind of mafia goons for certain lords and such. There's a big emphasis with Bushido on honor. In particular, not bringing dishonor to yourself, your daimyo, your emperor, your family, and that. And when that was determined that you did bring dishonor, in many cases, the samurai would take matters into their own hands, literally. They would engage in a thing called seppuku, which we refer to in the West as harikari, which was kind of ritual suicide. I had a book on Japanese samurai that there was a letter that a samurai wrote to his son, explaining to him the proper way to carry out seppuku. It seems like a really weird kind of thing to write to an 8-year-old, all right? But that's just to show you how serious they took that. And so when you in the video said that kind of the samurai had kind of their armor was a little bit different than European knights, where theirs was more metal, this is more kind of piece of leather. But the horse was the kind of the factor that was kind of the commonality. This is from a scroll showing a samurai fighting off Mongol warriors in that invasion that we talked about yesterday that was ended with the kamikaze win. Tomorrow, what I'm going to have you guys do, I'm not going to give you guys any notes, I'm going to do this DBQ. All right, I'm going to give you a couple of days to work on it, comparing kind of Japanese samurai with European knights. All right, finding the comparisons and the contrast with that. All right. And then what emerges here that's a little bit different than kind of European feudalism is a title that doesn't really have any kind of similarities, really, called shogun, which shogun is essentially a military dictator, not just a restaurant. And so shoguns were, during the early part of the Heian Age, they were a position that was basically kind of appointed by the emperor, but around the 12th century, there was a shogun by the name of Yoritomo Minamoto, who, like I say, is the first one to take this title of shogun, as it means as military dictator, just to kind of preface that. What he ends up doing is passing on this title to his son. So this is where we start to see the shogun actually have more political and military influence than the emperor does. The emperor is still there, but we start to see the emperor kind of relegated almost to kind of a figure that is inspirational rather than aspirational to a certain extent. All right. So the Minamoto clan is going to kind of create almost their own dynasty, kind of simultaneously with the Yamato clan. All right. And so later you're going to find the age of shoguns are going to last up until the 1800s, the Meiji Restoration. All right. There's my man Yoritomo Minamoto. What emerges here is almost two capitals simultaneously existing. They refer to this period as the Kamakura period, named after the kind of ancestral home of the Minamoto clan, where they essentially established their kind of military capital. So you have Kyoto, and Kyoto with the emperor and all the kind of court pomp and circumstances there, and then you have Kamakura, where really the kind of the real power was vested in there at this period. All right. And then this is the Kamakura period is going to give way to the Yakushiro period, and then that's going to give way to Tokugawa Ieyasu, who's probably the more famous kind of shogun in the 1600s. All right. So geographically speaking, here is Kyoto right here, all right, and then over here is Kamakura. So you say you basically got two kind of capitals emerging there. In Kamakura, you have a number of Buddhist and Shinto temples and shrines and stuff like that. Probably the most famous kind of Buddhist statue in Japan is located in Kamakura. They call this the Kamakura Buddha, which is believed to be the tallest Buddhist statue of Buddha sitting cross-legged. Every Buddhist country seems to have a statue of the Buddha doing something that makes it the largest, if you will. All right. So I'm going to move away from Japan. We're going to kind of knock out Korea here. In Korean history, much like with Japan, we see evidence of kind of settlements in the Neolithic period, but a lot of it is also connected to Chinese history. All right. Even so much so that there's a historical event that's chronicled by Chinese historians as well as Korean historians referred to as the Three Kingdoms period. This is kind of like Korea's warring states period. This is where we find three states all vying for control of the peninsula. This is like starting in the 300s, while the Yamato clan is establishing its dominance in Japan, we see three states that are all kind of vying for control here. This lasts up until about the 600s. Right. And so the geography of that is as such. Now, the first and the oldest state is the Goguryeo, which is based in the northern part of Korea. Their capital is the city of Pyongyang, which is currently today the capital of North Korea. The North Korean government claims a direct link with this dynasty to basically kind of tell those in South Korea that they are the true kind of like basically one of the factors that they should be the true leaders of the peninsula. It was weird. In 2015, the North Korean government announced that they found the remains of a unicorn layer, where they found remains of unicorns. This ties in within kind of in the Korean mythology. There was these kind of like spiritual entities that were like kind of like unicorns. So that was a weird thing to kind of announce, but it was a way to kind of like basically tell the South Korea that there's connection with the state of Goguryeo as well as the People's Republic of China. They were the ones who actually defeated the Sui when the Sui dynasty tried to invade China. That was one of the factors that led to the end of the Sui dynasty. This is the tomb of the first king of the founder of the Goguryeo dynasty, who was established in 37 BC, went by the name of King Domingong, which means Great King of the East. All right, it's a very kind of like Chinese-looking kind of temple, if you will. And then one of his sons is going to create a state to the south called the Bakje. Prince Oju, who was the younger son, the second son of Domingong, who realized he wasn't going to inherit. Instead of competing with his brother, he just basically took his ball and went elsewhere. So he ventured to the south. The Bakje are kind of considered the Phoenicians of Korea. They developed a navy. They're the first ones that are kind of a maritime power. There's direct links in trade with Japan. There's one theory that they may have introduced the Japanese to Buddhism, all right, although that's kind of debatable, if you will. But the Bakje kind of controlled kind of like the maritime trade within kind of that area between Korea and Japan. Sometimes it's spelled with a B. Some of the earliest evidence of kind of Buddhist temples or pagodas date back to the Bakje. This is the oldest, what they consider the oldest pagoda temple, Buddhist temple in South Korea. This is one of the older images of the Buddha incised into a cliffside there. And then the other one was Silla, which was established in the kind of southeastern part. Silla was probably the one that adopted the most kind of Chinese culture, particularly when it came to things like not just Buddhism, but Confucianism as well. Their court was kind of structured like the Tang Dynasty. Their alliance with the Tang Dynasty, although they paid tribute to the Tang Dynasty, allowed them to defeat the Bakje and the Goguryeo at one point, creating what they refer to as the United Silla. So for a period there, they were kind of the dominant power on the Korean peninsula. However, when the Tang Dynasty fell, the Sillas, like kind of like their power ebbed and flowed with the fall of the Tang Dynasty. This is the crown that the Silla king would wear, very kind of elaborate kind of gold crown. Then the reemergence of the Goguryeo under a new dynasty referred to as Goryeo. This is where Korea gets its name. Yeah, that's me. That's you. And so they were aligned with the Yuan dynasty, the Mongols. The Mongols used Korea as a jump-off point to invade Japan, all right, during the Kamakura period. That's when the kamikaze were occurred. Now, the Goryeo are going to remain in power. They're going to be the dominant power until the 1300s when a new dynasty called the Yi come to power, and then the Yi are going to remain in power up until the 20th century when Japan takes over. All right, so I'm done with Korean and Japanese history.
This is a quick reminder that next week we will continue celebrating Black History Month with Dress Up Days. Tuesday and Wednesday are My Hair, My Way. Wear your braids, afros, bonnets, do-rags, curls, color,